Violence has been a part of computer games almost since day one. One of the earliest video games, Space War, was a turn-based multiplayer game where players took turns trying to shoot each other's spaceships, and we've been shooting, stabbing, punching, and just generally killing each other ever since. But video games are just one subset of games, and the majority of games aren't all that violent. There are kids games like Tag and Hide and Go Seek and Red Light Green Light and Heads Up 7-Up and Simon Says and countless others. There are board games about the dangers of capitalism, communicating without words, and combining mathematical prowess and reading emotions. And there are a ton of sports that, despite being highly competitive and often full of testosterone, don't necessarily evoke actual violence. Even American football, often criticized for its militaristic undertones and themes of imperial invasion, pales in comparison to the violent pro-Western jingoism of Call of Duty. But for some reason, violence tends to be ubiquitous and constant in video games where other games can avoid the topic altogether. Why? Well, to answer that, we sort of have to back up and understand what games are. Games are systems defined by rules. There are also a whole lot of other things too, from storytelling devices to money-sucking addictions, from social activities to means of expression, from abstract simulations to autobiographical vignettes. But if there's one thing that binds all games together, it's some sort of rules that define the game, however informal or loosely enforced those rules may be. And there's nothing inherently violent about a rule-based system. Candyland and badminton aren't exactly corrupting our youth. And a vending machine is a classic example of a rule-based finite state machine, and they don't promote violence. Well, usually anyway. But when computers were added to the mix, they did two things. First, computers provided a convenient way of providing feedback to the player as to the state of the game. Instead of a game board or playing field, we had an infinitely modifiable plane to render anything we wanted to. Modestly at first, but eventually we were capable of reasonable refresh rates at 640 by 480 and 256 colors. And at this point we have 32-bit color and glorious high definition. Think about what this meant to the art of designing a game for a computer. You weren't stuck with little plastic pieces or worrying about having players fiddle with square tiles in an effort to represent a dungeon. You just draw it on the screen using any sort of graphics you want. Games were no longer limited to what you could easily represent on a kitchen table for $40 worth of plastic and cardboard, but could be about anything, literally anything, no matter how big or small, epic or mundane, literal or abstract. But while computers created a liberating new way to represent games, they also caused one other major change to the way games were designed. You see, when you make a video game, you're basically offloading the maintenance of the system and the enforcement of rules onto the computer. The catch is that computers think in ways that are fundamentally different than human beings. Computers lack empathy, creativity, or a sense of narrative. You won't be seeing them DM a good game of Dungeons & Dragons, they make for lousy poker buddies, and they're atrocious Calvin ball players. You can't embarrass yourself playing charades with just a computer, and your kid won't learn sportsmanship or how to win and lose gracefully by playing Geometry Wars. Generally speaking, games with more informal rules or a human emotional component tend to fall apart when run by a computer. But if there's one thing that computers are actually very good at, it's very formal systems. You know, Turing-complete rule sets and the like. And since the computer is responsible for executing all of the rules and maintaining the state of the game, that means you can simulate things in a way more complicated manner than you ever could by hand. Now, some developers take that power to create large formal systems and do very back-endy things with it. Sports management sims are a good example of this. Games neck-deep in variables and equations that would be tedious and awful to do by hand, but thanks to the miracle of computers, are now an enjoyable pastime. For some people. However, really complicated back-end systems tend to reduce the game as it's played to just manipulating a spreadsheet. This doesn't screenshot so well next to God of War and Call of Duty. Plus, the player's notion of perceivable consequence sorta goes out the window. There are visual representations of the variables in the system, say a menu that lets you observe and change tax rates in SimCity. But players don't get a lot of insight into the equations that these variables drive. You might get some sense that reducing the residential tax encourages residential growth, but by exactly how much or if there are other side effects is hard to judge when all you have to go on is a number. This sort of obfuscation of mechanics definitely has its uses, but it also makes the games harder to grok. But there is another Turing-complete formal system that manages to bypass the abstractions of tax rates and batting averages, manages to make that HD monitor look really swank, screenshots well, and provides players immediate feedback as to what they're doing in the system. Spatial simulation. Where the effects of tax rate adjustments in SimCity are an abstraction that need to be toyed with to get a feel for them, jumping in Super Mario Bros. Graphs the very algorithm you're trying to figure out right there on the screen. And it's all in real time. Players get an immediate visual representation of what their inputs are doing and what it means for the overall state of the game. On top of all of that, the result is a game that has a direct, literal visual metaphor. Instead of spreadsheets of abstract numbers, you can now have these same mechanics represent a guy in a tie, a wad of meat, or a blue hedgehog. It also turns out that spatial games are comparatively easy to develop a controller for. I mean, think about it. This entire thing is designed to facilitate input as directional data modified by states like jumping or shooting. With modern game consoles, and to some extent PCs, we've basically handcrafted machines that are fantastic at playing games about moving through and interacting with 2D and 3D worlds to the exclusion of everything else. From their inputs to their outputs, GPUs to joypads, these things are designed to simulate spaces. Now, obviously not all game mechanics fit into either a spatial or back-endy bucket, and I'm doing my damnedest not to be overly reductionist in my arguments. But it's telling that some of our most popular game genres around today are about physical or spatial simulation. Racing games, platforming games, shooters of every variety, sports games, fighting games, and RTS games all have core central mechanics about manipulating yourself or objects you control through space. Meanwhile, games that are more back-end heavy have taken more of a back seat, especially on home consoles. So what does all of this have to do with game violence? Well, I'm arguing that it's not that game developers selectively choose violence out of all possible topics they could cover. Instead, I posit that it's genuinely hard to systemize interactions on a computer that aren't physical or spatial in nature without making that system more obtuse to the player and more abstract to comprehend. Consequently, games tend to be more about spatial and physical conflicts, and as a result of that, violence pops up thematically more often than it does in other media. Now, all of the other reasons you heard about why violence exists in games are also true. Yes, violent conflict sells. It's why even story-heavy games like Mass Effect advertise themselves as exciting combat simulators despite hours of deep space probing. And yes, games are, on the whole, targeted to 18 to 35-year-old males with whom the whole lone soldier saving the world through violence shtick resonates really strongly. These exacerbate the situation, but I'd argue they're not really the true cause of it. But if you've never tried to make a game before, I think it's hard to describe exactly how hard it is to systemize a non-physical concept without exploding it out into a million rules and making it more complicated than any human being could ever understand, and without boiling it down to an insulting, simple level-up bar that completely misses the point. I mean, games have gotten so competent with systemizing player movement that I had a whole episode devoted to a sense of virtual movement as an aesthetic choice, carefully crafted by developers to elicit specific responses. That's the level we're at with games about movement. Contrast that with, say, our ability to systemize a simple conversation. There's the industry standard dialogue tree, which works great for RPGs with set narrative paths, but doesn't really simulate a conversation any more than a choose-your-own-adventure book does. I mean, imagine if Burnout simulated racing the way Mass Effect simulates conversation. You're approaching a curve. If you want to turn, press X. If you want to keep going straight, press Y. You have selected Y. Then there's the level up bar idea that something like The Sims uses. This mostly bypasses the act of conversation and mostly focuses on the outcome, whether someone likes you or not. This mechanic is to conversations what tabletop role-playing systems are to combat, a dice roll that sidesteps meaningful simulation with the act of pseudo-random outcomes. The combat analog of this sort of grinding is this sort of grinding. Speaking of the Elder Scrolls series, Oblivion had its own chat system, which was almost a desperate plea for help by the designers. For every round of conversation you have with an NPC, you need to intimidate them, joke with them, boast to them, and admire them.
I won't fight you. That's just not funny. Don't try to manipulate me. That's amazing.
This is not how real human beings interact. Honestly, it feels like it was sort of designed by an alien hive mind trying to approximate the quaint notion of individual beings having to communicate through audible grunts. What should be abundantly clear, if it isn't already, is that it's way easier to make a game where you pummel a man to death than it is to make a game where you shake his hand and get to know him. Violence isn't chosen as a topic for video games because developers necessarily want to make violent content. It's that violent content is the path of least resistance from every angle, technologically, aesthetically, and financially. And this isn't going to change. Mass markets aren't going to shift towards complicated and abstract simulations, and the hardware remains geared towards making spatial conflict particularly accessible for consumers and convenient for developers. The question isn't how we move beyond spatial simulation, but rather how we deal with the fact that it's an increasingly permanent fixture in how we design and understand games made to be played on machines. And for some people, this is an insurmountable problem. It's one of the many reasons that Chris Crawford left the gaming industry in the early 90s and holds incredulous views of its potential as a medium to this day.
The problem with artistic expression in games is that the games are fundamentally spatial, and the means of expression available to the player are very limited.
On the flip side, the majority of developers and gamers embrace the status quo, and the violence that goes with it. After 40 plus years of games about shooting and jumping and driving and killing, it's just sort of been accepted that this is what games are. It's gotten to a point where words like die, kill, gun, and shoot all have a different meaning in the context of games, totally dissociated from their real-world counterparts. Have you ever been in a public restaurant talking about a recent round of Team Fortress or Call of Duty only to get weird stares from everyone around you when you start talking about how you sniped that dude in the head? Other developers try a bit of a cross-breeding approach, putting stats into their games to simulate things like diplomacy, human interaction, emotion, and other systems that are hard to represent spatially, while keeping other aspects of the game highly physical and violent. But my favorite approach to this problem has got to be developers that try to make interaction with that spatial simulation meaningful. For example, in Jason Rohrer's The Passage, physical movement from left to right represents the passage of time for a slowly aging couple. Your lives are as much a physical journey through space as a journey through time, and distortion of the playfield as you play, with your entire future stretched out ahead of you early in the game, and the sum of your memories fading off into oblivion towards the end, contextualizes a traditional platformer trope in a powerful and emotionally engaging way. Braid's probably one of the classic examples of a designer making spatial movement meaningful. In this case, John Blow ties physical movement to temporal movement in a game that, at least in part, asks questions about how memory, identity, and motivation relate to one another. The game mechanics are intrinsically linked to the thematic material discussed in the text of the game, and both would be substantially weaker without the other. Finally, that game company's Flower is all about engendering a sense of peaceful meditation by providing a conflict-free sense of motion. When the evils of man show up later in the game, their evil is felt in part by reducing your freedom of movement, and this limitation on a game mechanic serves as a metaphor for oppression. Now again, I want to emphasize that not every video game mechanic falls into a spatial simulation or back-end mechanic bucket. Games can have both at once, and as you move towards more social games like MMOs, the possibility for more informal mechanics opens back up even in the realm of computer games. None of this is meant to be a hard and fast rule about how games are designed. Still, I find it hard to deny that the majority of video games are about physical interaction with one's environment, if only because it's what computers are good at simulating, rendering, and providing inputs for. And as long as violence sells and violence is the easiest thing to produce, violence will be with us. The question is whether we could beat back the stigma of empty, violent empowerment fantasies with mechanics that have meaning.